Me muero porque te has ido, me muero porque te extraño y te llora mi corazón.
Bernardo Rubalcaba was born in Monterrey, Mexico on March 6, 1996. At the age of 4, his family moved to Zurich, Switzerland, where he was enrolled in a Swiss school. Besides the little Spanish that he knew, he learned to speak Swiss German and German. 4 years later, when he was 8, his family moved again to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where he was enrolled in a Brazilian German school. Here, he learned to speak Portuguese. 2 years after that, his family moved back to Mexico, where he was enrolled at a Mexican German school. Today, Bernardo, 17, lives in Bogota, Colombia, and speaks 5 languages. He considers German to be his first.
At home, my family and I speak Spanish. It's the only language the 5 of us have in common, but it's very hard for me to express myself. There are many German words I use at home to express myself, but my family has a hard time understanding me. On the other hand, my siblings have a Spanglish language of their own at home, and I have a hard time understanding them.
Bernardo recalls that many times he had to go everywhere with his mother to translate things for her when they lived in Switzerland. He was only 6 years old.
My mom always needed me when she shopped for groceries. She couldn't ask for things like meat, and she never understood how much things cost. It was always very hard for her, so I always had to accompany her. I don't look Mexican, or at least not how people think Mexicans should look. I don't look like their idea of the stereotypical Mexican. I also have a weird mix of accents when I speak in Spanish. I have a mix of Colombian Spanish with some German and some Portuguese accent too. People don't tend to believe me when I tell them where I'm from.
No matter the country he was living in, Bernardo always got asked if he had certain Mexican qualities. The most common question was, do you know how to make tacos?
People always ask me if I know how to make tacos when I'm going to teach them how to make some. People always ask me if I know Vicente Fernandez, if I listen to his music, if I can sing rancheras. People always assume certain things about me because I'm Mexican.
Nevertheless, one of the biggest culture shocks for him was ironically in Colombia, a country where he thought he would not have any trouble with the language since he already spoke Spanish. What surprised him the most when he got there was the different style shift in Colombians use when they speak.
In Colombia, everybody talks to you in third person. When I'm with my friends or strangers, I talk to them in third person. In Mexico, that's very rare. You only talk to your elders or people that should be respected like that. I'm so proud to be Mexican. I love Mexico. I feel very identified with Mexican culture. And ever since I was born, my parents have made me aware of where I come from. I feel comfortable in my country, and every time I go back, I love the homey feeling I get.
Ana Berta Mora was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, to a low-income household. Her father left her mother and 2 sisters when she was only 3 years old. She vividly remembers the economic struggles they had to overcome. When she turned 15, her mother packed up and took her 3 daughters to live in Mexico City in hopes of a better life and education. At 19, Ana met her husband, who also came from a low-income household. Together, through hard work, they began to work their way up to Mexico's elite class. Their skin color and appearance played a big role on helping them get to where they are today.
Ser blanco en México te
Being white in Mexico opens up a lot of doors and gives you more opportunities. At work, I realized that it was easier for me to get promoted because I was light-skinned and I did not have indigenous features.
de piel oscura o con rasgos autóctonos.
Together, Ana and Miguel had 3 children, all of whom were born in Monterrey, Mexico. They had no idea their kids would become third culture kids who would not grow up in their native country. When Anna turned 40, her husband got a promotion to move to Zurich, Switzerland for the company he worked for. She had never been to Switzerland before and had no notion of the culture or language. She arrived in 2000.
Fue emocionante el saber que íbamos a vivir en otro país.
At first, my family and I were extremely excited to know that we were going to live in another country. But once we got there, it was very hard to adapt. I think I had the hardest time because I was very alone. My kids were at school and my husband was at work or traveling. I didn't speak the language, and simple things like going to the supermarket or introducing yourself to the neighbors became an everyday struggle.
It was all a very hard process for her. She felt lonely, scared, and she noticed that her kids were picking up on the language and culture faster than she was. This caused a sense of infantilization that she had never felt before. She needed her 4-year-old to translate things for her anywhere they went, and her 13-year-old son to translate the weekly English newsletters she received from his school. However, the hardest part for her was getting used to the food.
Fue difícil porque, bueno, estábamos acostumbrados.
We were used to our own food like spicy meals and tortillas. You couldn't find this at the supermarkets. I mean, in every country we have lived in, the food differed from that of Mexico, and the portions were a lot smaller too. Every time we visited Mexico, we would bring as much food with us as possible.
The weather was also a big issue for her. The cold would depress her, which made her feel alone. She also had a hard time making friends and meeting people that were willing to help her learn the culture and norms. She found that the only people who were willing to lend a hand were Latinos.
Cuando la gente se enteraba que era mexicana, sus comentarios eran...
When people found out I was Mexican, their usual comments were funny, because for them, being Mexican means being exotic. The only thing most of them knew about Mexico was that we drank a lot of tequila and Coke, and that we watched a lot of TV. So yes, they did see me with certain skepticism. They thought we were an exotic culture, very distinct from theirs. At home, we don't drink tequila or Coke, and we barely watch TV.
Tomábamos mucho tequila. Que se tomaba mucha Coca-Cola.
Nevertheless, regardless of which country they were living in, Ana and her husband were very keen on raising their children immersed in Mexican culture.
Siempre tuve muy claro que
in our hearts, we always knew that living outside of Mexico was temporary and that one day we would come home. We just weren't sure when. It was important for my kids to feel completely identified with Mexico, the Spanish language, and the traditions, such as celebrating Independence Day.
Con sus costumbres y con sus tradiciones.
There was all sorts of code switching at home, from Spanish-German to Spanish-English, and further on, Portuguese too. Sometimes she feared her kids would forget the very little notion of Mexico and Spanish language they knew.
Sometimes it was difficult to help them with their homework or even just communicating. Over time, they started to forget words in Spanish and would replace them with English or German word. My kids became pochos. I always reminded them that I only spoke Spanish, and sometimes they would have to explain what they were trying to say, and that way I could remind them of the Spanish word.
6 years after leaving home, Ana and her family moved back to Mexico. The idea that she was coming back to everything she knew gave her immense relief, something she had not felt in a long time.
Fue muy emocionante cuando
It was very exciting for the whole family when my husband's work relocated us back to Mexico. There were many times when I felt like we no longer belonged in our country. We only visited once a year, and when we did, it was hard for us to integrate with our family and friends again. They were living in the same lives as before, and ours had completely changed. We didn't have a lot of things in common anymore.
Mirra Angélica Durazo Jamarillo was born in Tijuana, Mexico. She's the oldest of 5 siblings. When she was 12, her family migrated to San Diego, California. She remembers how hard it was for her to feel accepted.
They used to bully us, me and my brothers, and they used to tell us mean things because we were Mexican. They used to say that we were beaners and wetbacks, and just because we didn't speak the language. We didn't know English. We were here to learn English. They used to chase us. They used to just follow us home, and we would walk around, you know, just among ourselves because we really didn't fit in.
Mirna's transition to the United States was filled with trials and tribulations, which made her feel isolated and turned her into a loner. She knew that her accent and appearance gave her identity away, so seamless assimilation was not an option for her. This made it hard for her to fit in with los gringos.
I didn't have the same cultural background, and so my parents were very strict. I wasn't allowed to go hang around with my friends at their houses. I wasn't allowed to use their phone. At the beginning, when I started coming to this side of the border, yes, it was definitely culture shock. I was resistant because I didn't feel comfortable with the language. So I always made sure that I hang around with people that spoke Spanish for the same reason that I wanted to be understood and not judged. Because in school, I happened to be picked on consistently for not being able to say like the typical words that get people confused, like yellow and jello.
However, language was always her biggest struggle.
I wouldn't say that I was as fluent as I probably feel like I am today. That doesn't mean that I don't have an accent, but I still struggle with the language. No matter how much you want to feel comfortable with the language, you keep referring back to your base language, your home language. And in Spanish, I am more myself. I'm more romantic. I'm more of a dreamer. I have so many hopes. And in English, it just feels like I do think in English and I can speak in English and feel comfortable with my thought process, but I just feel like I'm not true to myself somehow.
In 1992, Mirna's first child, Alexa, was born in San Diego. She always instilled the Mexican culture in her kids. She only speaks to them in Spanish and constantly reminds them of where they come from and what it means to be Mexican.
Mexico, to me, it's the language. Feeling part of something that makes me feel good. But obviously I always wanted to make sure that my kids had a bit of that with them. It's so independent, so isolated here. It's like we all mind our own business, and my neighbor minds her own business, my other neighbor too. And in Mexico it was a little more family oriented, more communal than it is here. What I miss the most is that we are a single culture to some degree. We know that we're Mexican. We don't talk about race. We don't talk about you being African American, you being Mexican, you being Filipino or Asian. And I don't mind the languages. I strongly feel that it's important that we are united in that sense, but I really like the fact that we're not competing to be the better race of anything. We're just living. We just do what we have to do, and we go to work and we go home and we live. That's it. And here it seems like you're consistently competing and you have your guard, you know, like you're always ready with your fist up so that you can keep fighting.
Regardless of the cultural struggles Mirna has faced here, she's thankful for all the opportunities this country has given her and her family. Yet, like millions of immigrants, she has maintained a strong tie with her homeland, which she misses every single day.
Te has quedado clavada en mi pecho.